Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to another haunting tale brought to you by Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy stories that linger in the quiet corners of your mind long after the lights go out, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring more bedtime stories to life. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let the shadows speak. In the autumn of 2019, in the quiet town of Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, where the trees bled crimson and gold and the air carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke, a peculiar discovery unraveled beneath the floorboards of an unassuming suburban home. The house stood at the end of Sycamore Lane, a modest two-story colonial with white siding, a slightly sagging porch, and a garden that had long since surrendered to wild ivy. It belonged to Elara Voss, a retired librarian in her late 60s, who had lived there alone since the passing of her husband nearly a decade prior. Elara was known in the neighborhood for her meticulous yard, her weekly book donations to the local school, and her habit of leaving jars of homemade elderberry jam on neighbors' doorsteps every October. She was quiet, polite, and kept mostly to herself, traits that, in a town like Mill Creek, earned her both respect and gentle curiosity. But no one suspected what lay hidden beneath her basement stairs. The basement itself was ordinary enough. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, shelves lined with canning jars and gardening tools. Yet, tucked behind a false panel near the furnace, behind a stack of yellowed National Geographic magazines from the 1980s, was a narrow crawlspace no more than 3 feet high. It had gone unnoticed for years, perhaps even decades, until a persistent leak in the ceiling forced Elara to call in a contractor. His name was Thaddeus Boone, Thad to those who knew him, and he wasn't from Mill Creek. He'd moved to the area only a few months earlier, renting a small apartment above the hardware store downtown. Thad was in his early 40s, with calloused hands, a slow way of speaking, and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He arrived on a Tuesday morning just after dawn, with his toolbox slung over one shoulder and a thermos of black coffee in the other hand. The leak, he explained, likely stemmed from a cracked pipe behind the drywall. To fix it properly, he'd need to remove a section of the basement ceiling near the stairs. Elara agreed, offering him tea and a seat at her kitchen table while he worked. She watched through the window as he descended into the basement, his boots echoing softly against the concrete. It was nearly an hour later when Thad called up the stairs, his voice low and measured. "Ma'am, you might want to come down here." Elara descended slowly, gripping the handrail with both hands. At the bottom, Thad stood beside the open crawlspace, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes that swirled in the stale air. Inside, nestled among bundles of brittle newspaper and rusted tin boxes, were dozens of small hand-bound journals. Their covers were faded leather, tied shut with twine. Beneath them lay a rusted lockbox, its surface pitted with age, and a single black and white photograph of a young woman standing beside a horse-drawn cart in front of what looked like an old general store. Elara's breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the photograph. "That's my grandmother," she whispered. "Lillian Voss. She lived here, before the house was even built. This land used to be her family's orchard." Thad didn't speak. He simply stepped back, giving her space. Over the next several days, Elara pored over the journals by lamplight, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. The entries, written in Lillian's looping cursive, told a story far darker than anyone in Mill Creek had ever imagined. In the winter of 1923, Lillian had taken in a traveling preacher who claimed to be fleeing persecution in the South. He stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in the barn, helping with chores, and preaching quiet sermons beneath the apple trees. But something changed. According to Lillian's final entries, the man grew erratic, speaking in tongues, claiming to see visions in the well water, insisting that the orchard was cursed ground. One night he vanished. So did 2 local boys who had been seen speaking with him days before. The town searched for weeks, but no trace was ever found. Then, in a chilling addendum dated March 17, 1924, Lillian wrote, "I found the cellar beneath the root cellar. He dug it himself, I think. There are things down there, things I cannot name. I have sealed it with stone and mortar. May God forgive me for what I must now do." Elara sat frozen in her armchair, the journal open on her lap. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the window panes. She looked toward the basement door, half expecting to hear something stir in the darkness below. The next morning she called Thad again. "I need you to help me open that space," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiled in her chest. "All of it." Thad returned that afternoon, this time with a crowbar and a respirator. Together, they broke through the false wall behind the furnace, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into blackness. The air that rose from below was cold, unnaturally so, and carried the faint scent of wet soil and something metallic. At the bottom, they found a chamber no larger than a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with symbols carved deep into the stone, crude, jagged shapes that seemed to pulse in the flickering beam of Thad's flashlight. In the center of the room lay a rusted iron chest, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were bones. Small ones. Child-sized. Wrapped around them was a tattered Bible, its pages filled not with scripture, but with frantic scrawls in the same hand as the journals. Asterisk, he said they would rise again. You lied. They only scream. Asterisk. Ilara sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had lived above this horror her entire life, never knowing, never suspecting. Local authorities were called. The remains were carefully removed and identified through dental records as those of the two missing boys from 1924. The case, long considered cold, was quietly reopened, though no charges could ever be filed. The preacher's name had vanished from every record as if he'd never existed at all. In the weeks that followed, Ilara packed her belongings and moved into a small cottage on the edge of town. She donated the house to the Historical Society with one condition. The basement was to be sealed permanently, filled with concrete, and never opened again. Thad stayed in Mill Creek for a while longer, though he rarely spoke of what he'd seen. When asked, he'd simply shake his head and say, "Some doors are better left closed." And so, the house on Sycamore Lane stands empty now, its windows dark, its garden overgrown. But on still nights, when the wind dies down and the world holds its breath, neighbors swear they can hear faint whispers rising from the earth beneath the porch, as if the ground itself remembers. Weeks turned into months, and the house on Sycamore Lane remained untouched. Its windows shuttered, its mailbox rusted shut, its front walkway slowly being reclaimed by creeping moss and wild clover. The Historical Society, true to Ilara's request, had poured thick concrete over the basement floor, sealing the chamber beneath with finality. Yet, despite the physical barrier, something about the property unsettled even the most pragmatic townsfolk. Delivery drivers refused to leave packages at the door. Teenagers dared each other to touch the gate but never lingered long. Even the stray cats that once sunned themselves on the porch steps now gave the place a wide berth. Thaddeus Boone, meanwhile, found himself unable to shake the memory of that cold stone chamber. He began dreaming of the symbols carved into the walls, angular, asymmetrical marks that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. In his dreams, the iron chest would creak open on its own, and from within would rise not bones, but whispers, soft, overlapping voices speaking in a language that felt ancient and wrong. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the taste of copper sharp on his tongue. One evening, while sorting through old receipts at the hardware store where he sometimes picked up odd jobs, Thad noticed something strange. Tucked between two invoices from 1998 was a brittle, yellowed envelope addressed to Lillian Voss, Orchard House, Mill Creek. The postmark read October 3, 1924, just days after Lillian's final journal entry. Curious, he carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges frayed, covered in the same frantic handwriting from the Bible in the chest. He walked still, it read. Asterisk, not in flesh but in echo. He waits where the roots twist deepest. Do not let the house sleep. Keep the lamps lit. Keep the doors barred. He feeds on silence. Asterisk. Thad's hands trembled. He showed the letter to no one, not even Ilara, who now lived 3 miles east in a cottage shaded by hemlocks and silence. Instead, he returned to Sycamore Lane under the cover of dusk, flashlight in hand, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. The gate groaned as he pushed it open. The air was thick, still, as if the entire yard were holding its breath. He circled the house slowly, eyes scanning the foundation, the basement windows now bricked over with fresh mortar. Then he saw it. Near the old apple tree, the last survivor of Lillian's orchard, a patch of earth had been disturbed. Not dug up exactly, but sunken. As though something beneath had shifted. Kneeling, Thad pressed his palm to the soil. It was cold. Colder than the October air warranted. And when he leaned closer, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping like fingernails against stone. He backed away quickly, heart hammering. That night, he packed a duffel bag and left Mill Creek without telling anyone. His landlord found his apartment empty the next morning, rent paid through the end of the month, a single note taped to the fridge. Asterisk, gone west. Don't look for me. Asterisk. But the story didn't end there. In early spring of 2020, a new family moved into the house next door, the Whitmores. Daniel and Mara, both professors at the local college, with their 8-year-old daughter Juniper. They knew nothing of the sealed basement or the whispers. To them, Sycamore Lane was simply a quiet street in a charming town, perfect for raising a child. Juniper, however, sensed something immediately. She refused to play in the backyard after dusk. She claimed the old apple tree watched her. At first, her parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination. But then came the drawings. Every morning, Juniper would leave sketches on the kitchen table, crude but detailed renderings of a man in a long coat standing beneath the apple tree, his face blurred, his hands outstretched. Sometimes he held a book. Other times he held nothing at all. When Mara gently asked where she got the idea, Juniper would only whisper, "He talks to me when the house is quiet." Alarmed, Daniel spoke with neighbors. Most changed the subject. One elderly woman, Mrs. Gable from across the street, finally pulled him aside one afternoon. "You best keep that child away from that tree," she said, voice low. "And don't ever let her go near the Voss place. Some things don't stay buried just because you pour concrete over 'em." That same week, Juniper began sleepwalking. Mara found her one night standing barefoot on the back porch, facing the sealed house, her nightgown damp with dew. When shaken awake, she blinked up at her mother with glassy eyes and said, "He says the door is almost open." Terrified, the Whitmores consulted a local historian, who reluctantly shared fragments of the Lillian Voss journals, enough to confirm their worst fears. They contacted Alara, who agreed to meet them at a diner on the edge of town. Over coffee gone cold, she told them everything. The preacher, the boys, the chamber, the warning in the letter. "He didn't die," Alara said quietly, stirring her cup though she hadn't added sugar. "Not really. Lillian believed he bound himself to the land. That as long as the house stood, so would he. That's why I had it sealed. Not to hide the past, but to keep it from waking up." The Whitmores considered moving. But leases, jobs, and Juniper's worsening episodes made it difficult. Instead, they installed motion sensor lights around their yard, kept all windows locked after sunset, and played soft music through the night, anything to break the silence the entity seemed to crave. For a time it worked. Then, on the night of the autumn equinox in 2021, the power went out across Mill Creek. Not just a flicker, a deep, total blackout that swallowed the neighborhood in absolute dark. The Whitmores lit candles, huddled together in the living room. Juniper clung to her mother, trembling. From outside came a sound. Not wind. Not an animal. It was a voice, dry, rasping, singing an old hymn in a tune no one recognized. It came from the direction of the apple tree. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through the black, landing on the trunk of the tree. Carved into the bark, fresh and raw, were the same jagged symbols Thad had seen in the basement chamber. And beneath them, written in what looked like charcoal, or something darker, were 3 words. Asterisk, "She is mine." Asterisk. He rushed back inside, locked the door, and called the police. But by the time officers arrived, the carving had vanished. The bark was smooth, unmarked. Even the hymn had ceased. Juniper didn't speak for 3 days. When she finally did, it was to whisper a single sentence to her mother as they sat by the window at dawn. "He says the concrete is cracking." No one checked. No one dared. But Alara did. From her cottage, she watched the house on Sycamore Lane through binoculars every evening. And one morning, just after the first frost, she saw it. A hairline fracture running diagonally across the basement-sealed window, thin as a spider's thread, glistening faintly in the pale sun. She didn't tell anyone. There was no point. Some truths are too heavy for words. Instead, she began leaving jars of elderberry jam not just on neighbors' steps, but on the cracked sidewalk in front of the empty house. A silent offering. A plea. A hope that sweetness might hold back the hunger beneath the soil. And so the town carries on. Children grow. Seasons turn. But in Mill Creek, no one walks past the house on Sycamore Lane after dark. No one mentions the apple tree. And everyone, without saying it aloud, knows to keep their homes filled with noise, music, laughter, the hum of appliances, anything to drown out the silence that waits, patient and hungry, beneath the earth. Years passed, though time in Mill Creek had a way of folding in on itself, seasons blurring at the edges like watercolors left in the rain. The house on Sycamore Lane remained empty, its presence a quiet scar on the neighborhood's skin. New families came and went, some staying only months before citing a feeling they couldn't explain. Others lasted longer, but none ever truly settled. There was always something, a draft where no window was open, a whisper in the plumbing, a shadow that lingered too long in the corner of the eye. By the spring of 2024, Juniper Whitmore was nearly 12. She no longer spoke of the man beneath the apple tree, not even in her sleep. Her parents believed, or perhaps hoped, that the entity had lost interest. They kept the music playing softly at night, yes, but the fear had dulled into routine, like checking the stove before bed or locking the car doors. Life, after all, insists on continuing, even in the shadow of something that should not be. But Juniper remembered. She remembered the hymn. The cold breath against her neck during those sleepwalking nights. The way the air thickened whenever she passed the old Voss property on her bike. And most of all, she remembered the voice, not loud, not angry, but patient. Waiting. It was on a humid evening in late June, just after her 12th birthday, that Juniper made a decision. She waited until her parents were engrossed in a documentary, the television casting a blue glow across the living room. Slipping out the back door with a small backpack, containing a flashlight, a notebook, a salt shaker, a trick she'd read about online, and her grandmother's silver locket, she crossed the dew-damp grass toward the forbidden house. She didn't plan to go inside. She told herself she only wanted to see, to prove once and for all that it was just a house. Just wood and brick in silence. But the moment her foot touched the first step of the Voss porch, the air changed. It grew still. Not quiet, still. As if the world had paused mid-breath. Crickets ceased. Leaves stopped rustling. Even the distant hum of the highway faded into nothing. Juniper's pulse roared in her ears. She turned to leave, but the gate behind her clicked shut, though no wind had blown. Then from the basement came a sound. Not a tap. Not a whisper. A sigh. Long, slow, and deeply human. Her breath hitched. She backed toward the porch railing, fumbling for her flashlight. When she flicked it on, the beam trembled across the bricked-over basement window. And there, in the center of the concrete seal, was a crack. Not hairline this time, but wide enough to slip a finger through. From within, something glistened. Wet. Dark. A drop fell onto the soil below. Not water. It smelled like old pennies and turned earth. Juniper turned and ran. She didn't stop until she was inside her own house, door locked, lights blazing in every room. Her parents found her curled on the kitchen floor, shaking, her backpack spilled open, the silver locket clutched so tightly in her fist it left crescent marks in her palm. That night, Daniel Whitmore called Alara Voss. She arrived within the hour, wrapped in a wool shawl despite the summer heat, her eyes sharp beneath the brim of her hat. Without a word, she took Juniper's hand and led her to the porch swing. They sat in silence for a long while, watching fireflies blink over the overgrown lawn of the Voss house. "He's waking," Alara finally said, her voice low but steady. The seal wasn't meant to last forever. Lillian knew that. She only bought time. Time for what? Juniper asked, her voice small. For someone to finish what she started. The next morning, Alara returned to her cottage and unearthed a wooden box from beneath her floorboards. Its hinges rusted, its surface carved with the same symbols Juniper had seen in her dreams. Inside lay a bundle of dried yarrow, a vial of river water collected on All Hallows' Eve, and a slender iron nail bent into the shape of a cross. These were Lillian's, Ilara explained when she brought them to the Whitmore's kitchen table. She couldn't destroy him. But she believed he could be bound again, if the right words were spoken over the right ground, by someone who hadn't been touched by fear. She looked at Juniper. "You hear him," Ilara said gently. "That means he's chosen you as his bridge. But bridges can be burned." Mara protested. Daniel argued. But Juniper, pale but resolute, nodded. They waited for the new moon. On the appointed night, under a sky so black it seemed to swallow stars, the four of them stood at the edge of the Voss property. Ilara carried the box. Juniper held the iron nail. Salt lined their pockets. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle and something older, something that smelled like stone and bone. Ilara began to speak. Not in English but in a dialect Juniper had never heard, soft, guttural, ancient. The words seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath their feet. As she spoke, Juniper stepped forward, heart pounding, and pressed the iron nail into the crack in the basement seal. The moment metal touched concrete, the earth groaned. Windows rattled. Branches snapped without wind. From deep below came a sound like 1,000 voices screaming through cloth. Juniper didn't flinch. She closed her eyes and whispered the only words that came to her. Not from a book, not from a spell, but from her own heart. "You don't belong here." The ground shuddered once, then fell still. Silence returned, but this time it was clean. Empty. Natural. The crack in the concrete did not vanish, but it no longer glistened. It dried. Crusted over. Sealed itself with dust and time. They never saw or heard the entity again. In the months that followed, birds returned to the apple tree. Children played near the sidewalk without shivering. The house on Sycamore Lane, though still empty, lost its aura of dread. Real estate agents even listed it again, this time with no disclaimers. Juniper kept the iron nail on a chain around her neck. She never took it off, not even to sleep. Ilara, satisfied that the balance had been restored, began writing a new journal, one not of fear but of remembrance. She titled it ***, What the Roots Remember. In it, she documented everything: Lillian's courage, Thaddeus's flight, the Whitmore's love, and Juniper's quiet strength. She left a copy with the town archives, sealed in wax, with instructions to open it only if the apple tree ever bloomed out of season. Years later, when Juniper was grown and studying folklore at university, she would return to Mill Creek every autumn. She'd sit beneath the old tree, now heavy with fruit, and read aloud from Ilara's journal. Neighbors would sometimes pause on their walks, listening to the sound of her voice mingling with the rustle of leaves, and feel, for the first time in decades, that the land was at peace. But peace, like silence, is fragile. And somewhere, deep beneath the roots, the earth still holds its breath. The peace in Mill Creek held for nearly 3 years. Winters came and went with ordinary snowfall. Springs bloomed without unease. The house on Sycamore Lane even found new occupants, a retired couple from Ohio named Harlan and Miriam Finch, who bought it for its quaint charm and solid bones. They repainted the shutters, planted marigolds along the walkway, and hung wind chimes that sang softly in the breeze. To the townsfolk, it seemed the past had finally been laid to rest. But Juniper Whitmore, now 15 and spending her summer back home from boarding school, felt it the moment she stepped off the bus. It wasn't a sound, not a sight. It was a shift, subtle like the tilt of a scale just before it tips. The apple tree, once generous with its fruit, bore none that year. Its leaves curled at the edges, grayish-green, as if drained of vitality. And the wind chimes outside the Finch house? They never rang. Not once. Even on the stormiest nights, when gusts tore through the valley, those chimes stayed silent, as though the air itself refused to touch them. Juniper said nothing at first. She watched. She listened. She walked past the house each evening on her way to the library, eyes scanning the foundation, the porch, the bricked basement window, now painted over with white primer as if to erase its history. Then, one morning in early September, Miriam Finch appeared at the Whitmore's door, her face pale, her hands trembling around a ceramic mug of tea she hadn't touched. "Have you ever heard singing?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mara Whitmore exchanged a glance with Daniel before stepping aside. "Come in, Miriam." Over the next hour, Miriam confessed that for weeks Harlan had been waking in the middle of the night, standing at the foot of their bed, staring toward the basement door. When she asked him what was wrong, he'd only murmur, "He's teaching me the words." At first she thought it was sleepwalking. But then she began hearing it too, a low, rhythmic chanting from beneath the floorboards, always just loud enough to register, never clear enough to understand. Worse still, Harlan had started digging. Not in the yard. Not with a shovel. In the pantry. Beneath the linoleum, he'd pried up a floorboard and begun scratching at the earth with his bare hands, muttering about loosening the seal. Miriam had nailed the board back down, but by dawn it was loose again. Juniper listened from the hallway, her fingers brushing the iron nail at her throat. That evening she returned to Sycamore Lane, not as a child, but as someone who knew the weight of what slept beneath. She knocked on the Finch's door. Harlan answered, his eyes bloodshot, his shirt stained with soil. He smiled, but it didn't reach his pupils. They were too wide, too dark. "Juniper," he said as if they were old friends. "You've come to hear the song, haven't you?" She didn't flinch. "I've come to remind you that some songs were never meant to be sung." He tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. Then softly, "He says you're the one who closed the door. But doors can be opened from both sides." Juniper stepped back. "Stay away from the basement, Mr. Finch. Please." She left before he could reply, her pulse a drumbeat in her temples. The next day she visited Alara. The old woman was frilier now, her hands gnarled like tree roots, but her mind was sharp as flint. She listened in silence as Juniper recounted everything. When Juniper finished, Alara rose slowly from her rocking chair and walked to the bookshelf. She pulled down a slim volume bound in black cloth, no title, no markings. Inside were pages filled not with words, but with drawings. Spirals, inverted crosses, eyes within triangles, and at the center of each page the same symbol carved into the vast basement wall. "This isn't a summoning," Alara said, her voice thin but firm. "It's an invitation. And once accepted, it can't be unrung." Harlan didn't dig because he wanted to. He dug because he was asked. "Can we stop it?" Juniper asked. Alara looked out the window toward the distant roofline of the Voss house. "Not with salt. Not with nails. This time it wants a name. And names have power, especially when spoken by the one who remembers." That night, under a sky streaked with high, wispy clouds, Juniper returned to Sycamore Lane with Alara's book tucked beneath her arm. The Finch's lights were off, but a faint amber glow pulsed from the basement. A light that shouldn't exist, not behind sealed concrete and brick. She didn't knock. Instead, she walked to the base of the apple tree, knelt in the dry soil and opened the book to its final page. There, written in Lillian's hand, was a single phrase in Latin. Asterisk nomen ius est silentium. Asterisk his name is silence. But Lillian had added a note in the margin. Asterisk he has no true name. So we give him one. Speak it and he must answer. Speak it again and he must obey. Asterisk. Juniper closed her eyes. She thought of the two boys lost in 1924. Of Thaddeus running west into the unknown. Of her own sleepless nights. Of the earth that remembered everything. Then she spoke, not in Latin but in plain English, clear and strong. Your name is forgotten. The ground trembled. From the basement came a shriek, not of rage but of recognition, of being known. Windows shattered in the Finch house. The wind chimes finally rang, clattering wildly, then fell still. Inside, Harlan Finch collapsed to his knees, gasping as if surfacing from deep water. Miriam found him moments later, sobbing, his hands raw, his voice hoarse from chanting words he couldn't recall. By dawn, the amber glow was gone. The crack in the basement seal had sealed itself once more, not with concrete but with something darker, smoother, like obsidian. It reflected no light. It absorbed it. Harlan and Miriam moved out a week later, citing health reasons. The house stood empty again, but this time no one felt uneasy. The apple tree sprouted new buds by mid-October, small, white, and fragrant. Juniper visited often, leaving offerings not of jam, but of pressed flowers and handwritten poems. She never spoke of that night, not even in her journal. Some victories are too quiet for words. Years later, when she returned to Mill Creek as an adult, now a professor of cultural memory and oral history, she brought her students to the town archives. There, in a climate-controlled drawer, lay Alara's journal, What the Roots Remember, and beside it, a new volume titled Asterisk, What the Silence Keeps. Asterisk both were open for public reading, though few understood their true weight. One autumn afternoon, as Juniper stood beneath the apple tree, now ancient, its branches heavy with fruit, a young student asked her why she kept coming back. She smiled, plucking a ripe apple and handing it to the girl. Because some stories aren't meant to be told, she said. They're meant to be tended. Like gardens. Like graves. Like promises made to the earth. And as the wind stirred the leaves above, carrying the scent of apples and damp soil, the house on Sycamore Lane stood quiet, not haunted, not empty, but watchful. As if it, too, remembered. Decades may pass, but in Mill Creek, time does not erase, it layers. Like sediment in a riverbed, each generation adds its weight to the stories buried beneath the soil. By the spring of 2042, Juniper Whitmore was no longer the girl who stood barefoot on a haunted porch. She was Dr. Juniper Whitmore, tenured professor, author of 3 acclaimed works on folk memory, and the quiet guardian of a truth most had long forgotten. She returned to Mill Creek not as a visitor but as a steward, buying the cottage once owned by Alara Voss, now weathered but still standing, its shelves lined with the same books, its pantry still smelling faintly of elderberries. The house on Sycamore Lane remained unoccupied, though not for lack of trying. Every few years someone would purchase it, drawn by its low price and deceptive charm, only to sell it again within months, citing structural concerns, or a persistent sense of being watched. The town council, weary of the cycle, finally reclassified the property as a historical preservation site, fencing it off with wrought iron and posting discreet signs that read asterisk, private grounds. Do not enter. Asterisk few questioned it. Those who grew up in Mill Creek knew better than to ask. But new blood always flows into old towns. In the summer of 2043, a developer from Philadelphia named Cashin Vale arrived with grand plans. Charismatic, well-funded, and utterly dismissive of local superstition, he proposed converting the Sycamore Lane property into a boutique heritage inn, complete with restored interiors, a garden cafe, and guided historical tours. He called it Asterisk, the Orchard House Experience. Asterisk. At the town meeting, Juniper sat in the back row, arms crossed, listening as Cashin spoke of honoring the past while embracing progress. He mentioned Lillian Voss only in passing, a fascinating local figure, and dismissed the rumors as quaint folklore. When someone timidly brought up the basement, he laughed. Concrete and mold, folks. Nothing more. Juniper didn't speak that night. But the next morning she left a package on his rented doorstep. A copy of Alara's journal, bound in plain brown paper with a single note tucked inside. Asterisk, some roots do not like to be disturbed. Asterisk. Cashin read it. He even chuckled at first. But by the 3rd chapter, his laughter faded. He visited Juniper that afternoon, unannounced, standing on her porch with the journal under his arm. You expect me to believe this? He asked, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. I expect you to respect it, she replied, holding the screen door open just enough to speak through. The land remembers, and it doesn't care how much money you have. He left, but he didn't cancel his plans. Construction began in early September. Crews arrived with jackhammers, drills, and blueprints that called for partial basement restoration. Juniper watched from her window as they tore up the old porch, ripped out the overgrown shrubs, and, most alarmingly, began chipping away at the sealed basement entrance. That night the first worker quit. He claimed his drill bit shattered for no reason, and when he looked into the hole they'd started, he saw something move, like smoke with eyes. The next day 2 more walked off the job. By week's end, only Cashin and one stubborn foreman remained. Then the dream started. Cashin began waking at exactly 3:17 a.m., the time Juniper knew that Lillian Voss had written her final journal entry. In his dreams, he stood in a stone chamber, surrounded by whispering boys who pointed to a door made of roots. Behind it, something waited. Not angry, not hungry, just patient. He tried to ignore it. He played loud music on site. He brought in industrial-grade lights. He even hired a local priest to bless the grounds, a man who left after 5 minutes, pale and muttering about wrong kinds of quiet. The breaking point came on the night of the first frost. Cashin stayed late, determined to prove the rumors wrong. He descended into the partially excavated basement with a high-powered lantern, determined to reach the original floor. As he chipped at the obsidian-like seal Juniper had witnessed years before, the lantern flickered, then died. In the sudden dark he heard it. Not a voice, not a hymn, a breath, slow. It, right behind him. He turned. Nothing. But when he raised his hand to check his phone, he saw it. His shadow on the wall was not his own. It wore a long coat. It held a book, and its head tilted slowly to the side as if studying him. Cashin ran. He didn't stop until he reached his car, engine roaring before he'd even closed the door. The next morning he filed for an emergency permit withdrawal. The project was abandoned. The equipment was hauled away. The hole in the basement was filled with gravel and covered with a steel plate bolted shut. No one asked why. A week later, Cashin returned, not with blueprints but with a single potted sapling. He knocked on Juniper's door at dawn. "I don't believe in ghosts," he said, holding out the young apple tree. "But I believe in consequences. And respect." She took the sapling without a word. Together they planted it beside the old tree, now gnarled and hollow but still alive. As they patted the soil into place, Juniper finally spoke. "He doesn't live in the house," she said softly. "He lives in the forgetting. Every time someone tries to pretend the past didn't happen, he grows stronger." Cashin nodded. "Then I'll remember." He left Mill Creek that afternoon, but he kept in touch. Years later, he funded a small scholarship in Lillian Voss's name for local students studying history or folklore. The plaque, mounted near the town library, read simply, asterisk, for those who listened to the silence. Asterisk. Life settled once more. The new apple tree thrived. Children from the elementary school came on field trips to learn about local heritage, guided by Juniper herself. She never mentioned the bones, the preacher, or the iron nail she still wore beneath her blouse. But she taught them to listen, to the wind, to the trees, to the stories the earth holds in its bones. Then, in the autumn of 2051, something unexpected happened. The old apple tree, the original, bloomed. Not in spring. Not with white flowers. In October. With black blossoms. They were small, velvety, and emitted no scent. Yet birds avoided them. Bees gave them wide berth. Even the wind seemed to curve around the branches. Juniper stood beneath it for hours, her face unreadable. That night, she walked to the fence surrounding the Sycamore Lane property and pressed her palm against the cold iron. "It's not him," she whispered. "It's something else." The next morning, she called the university and took a sabbatical. She began researching not just local archives, but global accounts of memory trees, plants said to absorb the emotional residue of traumatic events. In Siberia, there were pines that wept resin in the shape of faces. In Ireland, hawthorns that bloomed only after a death. And in Appalachia, elders spoke of witness trees that flowered when a buried truth was about to surface. She realized then, the black blossoms weren't a warning. They were an offering. The land wasn't haunted by evil, it was grieving. And grief, when acknowledged, can transform. On the night of the full moon, Juniper returned to the Voss property with a simple wooden box. Inside were two things, the iron nail and a lock of hair from each of the two boys, preserved all these years in Alara's keeping. She placed the box at the base of the black blossom tree and spoke their names aloud for the first time in over a century. "Thomas Ellery, Samuel Pike, you are remembered." A breeze stirred, not cold, not warm, but gentle. The black petals began to fall, not crumbling, but dissolving into mist before they touched the ground. By dawn the tree was bare, but the soil beneath it shimmered faintly, like dew kissed by starlight. Years later, when Juniper was gone, her ashes scattered beneath both apple trees, the town planted a third sapling in her honor. And every October, on the anniversary of the black bloom, someone leaves a single jar of elderberry jam at the base of the fence. No one knows who, but the jam is always fresh. And the house on Sycamore Lane? It still stands, quiet, watchful. No longer a prison for silence, but a sanctuary for memory. For in Mill Creek they have learned the oldest truth of all: the dead do not haunt us. It is the unspoken, the unburied, the unremembered, that is what lingers. And so they speak, they remember, they tend the roots. Time, as it always does, kept moving. By the year 2063, Mill Creek had changed in ways both subtle and profound. Electric cars hummed down streets once trod by horse-drawn carts. Solar panels glinted on rooftops where wood shingles had weathered 100 storms. Yet, the heart of the town, the quiet reverence for what lies beneath, remained untouched. The house on Sycamore Lane stood as it had for decades, fenced, sealed, and surrounded by 3 apple trees now grown tall and intertwined, their branches weaving a canopy so dense that even midday sun filtered through in dappled fragments. No one lived there. No one tried to. Instead, the property had become something else entirely, a place of pilgrimage, though no one called it that aloud. Visitors came not with cameras or curiosity, but with quiet steps and folded hands. Some left handwritten notes tucked into the fence slats. Others brought small stones painted with names or dates. A few simply sat on the bench Juniper had installed years before, gazing at the trees as if listening for a voice only the roots could carry. The town never made it official. There were no signs, no plaques beyond the modest one near the library. But everyone knew, and everyone respected it. Then, in the spring of 2065, a letter arrived at the Mill Creek Historical Society. It bore no return address, only a postmark from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Inside was a single sheet of handmade paper, brittle at the edges, and a small velvet pouch tied with twine. The letter read, I am the grandson of Thaddeus Boone. He never spoke of Mill Creek, not once in all the years I knew him. But on his deathbed he pressed this into my hand and said, take it back. It belongs to the ground. I don't know what it is, but I know it's yours. Inside the pouch was a rusted iron key, small, ornate, its teeth worn smooth by time. It bore no markings, yet when held in the light just so, faint etchings along its bow resembled the same symbols once carved into the basement walls. The society director, a woman named Leora Chin who had grown up hearing whispers of the Voss house, knew exactly what to do. She walked the letter and the key to Juniper's old cottage, now maintained as a small archive and reading room by local volunteers. There, she placed both items on the desk where Juniper once wrote her books, beneath the framed photograph of the 3 women who had shaped the town's hidden history, Lillian, Elara, and Juniper herself. That night, Leora dreamed of a door. Not in a house, not in a basement, but in the earth itself, a door of woven roots and stone, standing open just a crack, light spilling from within. And from that light came the sound of children laughing. She woke with tears on her cheeks. The next morning she gathered a small group, the town archivist, the high school history teacher, and Mateo Rivera, a young botanist who had been studying the unusual symbiosis between the 3 apple trees. Together, they approached the Sycamore Lane property at dawn, the key heavy in Leora's palm. They did not intend to enter. They only wished to see if the key fit anything. At the base of the oldest tree, the one that had once borne black blossoms, they found it, a depression in the soil almost perfectly circular, about the size of a dinner plate. When Leora brushed away the leaves, she uncovered a stone disc embedded in the earth. In its center was a keyhole. Her hands shook as she inserted the key. It turned with a soft, grinding click. The ground did not shake. No wind rose. But the stone disc sank an inch, then split cleanly into 6 petals that folded back like a blooming flower, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. From within came not the scent of decay, but of rain-washed stone and wild mint. Mateo knelt, shining a light down. It's not a grave, he murmured. It's a vault. And it's dry. Impossibly dry. Leora hesitated. Then, remembering Juniper's teachings, that some doors are meant to be opened when the time is right, she lowered a small camera on a tether. The footage showed a chamber no larger than a closet, its walls lined with shelves. On those shelves rested dozens of glass jars, each filled with soil of varying colors. Labels in Lillian's hand read, Thomas's garden patch, Samuel's favorite creek bank, the preacher's shadow collected at noon. But at the center of the chamber sat a single book, bound in what looked like apple bark, its pages made of pressed leaves. They did not retrieve it that day. They resealed the stone, turned the key backward, and left the key buried beneath a fresh layer of soil. But they knew this was not a tomb. It was an archive. A library of memory, preserved not in paper alone, but in earth, root, and intention. Over the following months, Leora and Mateo began a quiet project. With permission from the town council and guidance from indigenous elders in the region, whose own traditions spoke of earth memory, they developed a protocol for honoring the site without disturbing it. School children now came not just to learn history, but to plant native flowers around the fence, to write letters to the past, to sit in silence and listen. And every year, on the anniversary of the day the key was turned, Leora would return alone at sunrise. She would place her palm flat on the stone disc and whisper the names, Thomas, Samuel, Lillian, Alara, Juniper, Thaddeus, and sometimes, just sometimes, the leaves above would rustle in a wind that hadn't yet risen. Years later, when Leora was old and her hair silver as frost, she trained a new generation to carry the quiet vigil. Among them was a girl named Wren, the great-great-niece of Harlan and Miriam Finch. Wren had grown up hearing the story not as a ghost tale, but as a lesson in responsibility. Memory is a living thing, Leora told her. It needs tending like a garden. Neglect it and it grows wild. Honor it and it bears fruit. Wren understood. She began recording oral histories from elders, digitizing Alara's journals, and even composing songs based on Juniper's poems. Her music, soft and haunting, played during the town's annual Remembrance Walk, a quiet procession held each October, where residents walked from the library to the Sycamore Lane fence, each carrying a candle and a name. No one spoke during the walk. No one needed to. The silence itself was the tribute. And so the cycle continued, not of fear but of care. Not of haunting but of healing. The house remained empty, yes, but it was no longer lonely. It was held. Remembered. Loved in the way only truth can be loved. Without flinching, without forgetting. For in Mill Creek, they had learned that the deepest secrets are not meant to be uncovered, but honored. That the past is not a wound to be reopened, but a root to be nourished. And that sometimes, the most powerful magic is simply saying a name out loud, so the earth knows it has not been abandoned. And on still nights, when the moon hangs low and the apple blossoms drift like snow, those who pause long enough might hear it, not a whisper, not a scream, but a sigh of gratitude rising from the soil, carried on the breath of a town that finally learned how to remember. By the year 2078, the world outside Mill Creek had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. Cities floated on data streams, memories could be archived in crystalline chips, and voices from centuries past spoke through AI recreations in museums and classrooms. Yet, in this quiet Pennsylvania town, the most profound technology remained the oldest: listening. The Sycamore Lane property was no longer just a local secret. It had become a quiet landmark in global conversations about ethical remembrance. Scholars of trauma studies, environmental memory, and restorative justice made pilgrimages, not to excavate but to witness. They came to see how a community could hold space for grief without spectacle, for history without exploitation. There were no tours, no ticket booths, no augmented reality overlays. Only a bench, 3 apple trees, and a stone disc that opened only for those who came with clean hands and quieter hearts. Wren Finch, now in her early 40s and serving as the director of the Mill Creek Memory Trust, had long since stopped calling it the haunted house. She called it the listening ground. Her work had evolved beyond preservation. With support from universities and indigenous knowledge keepers, she helped develop a framework called rooted remembrance, a practice that blended archival care with ecological stewardship and oral tradition. Students from across the country came to intern with her, learning to read soil like text, to interpret tree rings as timelines, to understand that silence is not absence, but presence held in reserve. One spring afternoon, as cherry blossoms drifted over the town square, a young man arrived at Wren's office. He introduced himself as Elias Voss, great-great-grandnephew of Lillian. He had grown up in California, raised by adoptive parents, and only discovered his lineage through a DNA test and a box of letters left in an attic in Ohio. Among them was a faded photograph of Lillian standing beside the original orchard, and a single line written on the back, asterisk, "If you ever find this, come home. The earth will know you." Asterisk. Wren looked at him, the shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw, and saw echoes of the woman in the black and white photo. Without a word, she handed him a trowel, a small jar, and a slip of paper with coordinates. "Go to the listening ground," she said. "Dig 6 inches down beneath the youngest tree. Take a handful of soil. Then sit and wait." Elias did as he was told. He knelt in the soft earth, the scent of damp loam and apple blossoms filling his lungs. As his fingers closed around the cool soil, something shifted, not in the ground but within him. A weight he hadn't known he carried began to loosen. Tears came, not from sadness but from recognition, as if his bones had been waiting for this moment all along. He stayed until dusk. When he returned to Wren's office, he carried not just the jar of soil but a question. "Can I stay?" he asked. "Not as a visitor. As a keeper." Wren smiled. The ground already said yes. "I'm just the one who heard it." Elias moved into the cottage once owned by Juniper. He restored the garden, replanted elderberries, and began transcribing Lillian's journals into a digital archive, though he insisted the originals remain untouched, stored in acid-free boxes beneath the floorboards, just as Alara had done. He also started a new tradition. Every new moon he would write a letter to Thomas and Samuel, updating them on the world, on peace treaties signed, on children born, on songs written, on trees planted. He would read the letters aloud beneath the apple canopy, then bury them in a shallow ring around the oldest trunk. The trees in turn seemed to respond. In the summer of 2081, the middle tree, the one Juniper had planted with Cashin Vale, bore fruit for the first time. Not ordinary apples, but golden ones, their skin shimmering faintly in sunlight. When tasted, they were tart yet sweet, with an aftertaste like rain and old paper. No one ate them greedily. They were shared only during the remembrance walk, one slice per person, passed hand to hand in silence. Scientists came, of course. They tested the soil, the water, the DNA of the trees. They found nothing anomalous. No radiation, no mutation, no chemical explanation for the golden fruit. One researcher, a woman named Dr. Amara Singh, stayed longer than the rest. She sat beneath the trees for 3 days, taking no notes, asking no questions. On the 4th morning, she approached Wren. "I came to study the anomaly," she said, "but I think I've been studying the wrong thing. It's not the fruit that's miraculous. It's the attention, the care, the decades of people choosing to remember instead of forget. That's what changed the soil. Not magic. Love." Wren nodded. Love is the oldest alchemy. As the decades deepened, the world grew louder, algorithms shouting, screens flashing, voices competing for attention. But Mill Creek remained a place of quiet resistance. Children were taught not just to read history but to tend it. School projects included planting memory gardens, writing letters to the past, and learning the names of those who had been lost to time. The town even developed a silence curriculum, where students spent 1 hour each week in complete quiet, learning to listen not just with their ears, but with their skin, their breath, their bones. And always, the listening ground stood at the heart of it. By 2095, Elias was gray at the temples, his hands rough from gardening and transcription. Wren had passed 2 years prior, her ashes scattered beneath the golden tree. In her will, she left the memory trust to Elias and a rotating council of young keepers, each chosen not for their credentials, but for their capacity to listen. One evening, as autumn painted the hills in fire and gold, Elias received a package from Oslo. Inside was a small wooden box and a note from a woman named Ingrid Larsen. Her great-grandmother, it turned out, had been one of the last people to see the traveling preacher before he vanished from records. Among her belongings was a pocket watch, its glass cracked, its hands frozen at 3:17. Engraved inside the casing were two words, "forgive me." Elias held the watch for a long time. Then he walked to the listening ground at dawn, knelt before the stone disc and placed the watch on the soil. "I forgive you," he said, not to the preacher but to the land, to the boys, to the women who had carried this burden so others wouldn't have to. The wind stirred. The leaves whispered. And for the first time in over a century the pocket watch ticked once, softly like a heartbeat returning. No one knows if the entity beneath the roots is truly gone. Perhaps it never was an entity at all, but a wound in the world's memory, slowly healing through acts of courage and care. What matters is this: the house no longer frightens. The basement no longer calls. The silence is no longer hungry. It is full. Full of names spoken aloud. Full of hands that plant instead of dig. Full of generations who understand that the deepest secrets are not meant to be solved, but held, like seeds, like promises, like love passed from one heart to the next. And so, the story continues, not with a scream but with a sigh of peace. Not with a door slamming shut, but with roots reaching deeper, branches stretching wider, and fruit ripening in the quiet light of a town that learned at last how to remember without fear. For decades, Mill Creek believed it had healed. The listening ground became a symbol of peace, a testament to how memory, when honored, could transform horror into holiness. Children played near the fence. Scholars wrote papers on restorative haunting. Tourists left flowers not out of fear but reverence. Even the wind seemed gentler there, as if the earth itself had exhaled after a century of holding its breath. But silence, no matter how sacred, can still be a veil. In the winter of 2099, during the longest night of the year, the 3 apple trees bloomed. Not in spring. Not with white or gold or black. With crimson. The blossoms unfurled at midnight, each petal slick with a dew that smelled faintly of iron. By dawn, the snow beneath the branches was stained pink, not from dye or pollution, but from something seeping up through the soil, thin, warm, and unmistakably alive. Elias Voss was the first to notice. He arrived at the listening ground as he did every morning, thermos in hand, boots crunching on frost. But the moment he stepped past the gate, his breath caught. The air was too still, too thick. And the stone disc at the base of the oldest tree was open. Not pried. Not broken. Invited. Inside the chamber, the glass jars of soil were gone. In their place sat a single object, the rusted iron key, now polished to a dull sheen, resting atop Juniper's bark-bound book. The pages were no longer made of leaves. They were made of skin, pale, stretched thin, stitched together with black thread. And on the cover, written not in ink but in what looked like dried blood, were 2 words. He remembers. Elias backed away, heart hammering. He reached for his comm device to alert the council, but it was dead. Not out of battery. Dead as if time itself had stopped flowing through it. Then he heard it. From deep beneath the roots, a voice, not rasping, not whispering, but clear, calm, and horribly familiar. "Thank you," it said, "for remembering me." The ground trembled, not with violence, but with awakening. The crimson blossoms fell, not drifting, but crawling, each petal twitching like a spider as it hit the snow. The fence groaned. The house, empty for over 80 years, lit up from within. Every window glowed with a soft amber light, the same light Harlan Finch had seen before he lost himself. Elias turned to run. But the gate was gone. In its place stood a figure in a long coat, face shadowed, hands clasped around a book that pulsed like a heart. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to, because Elias finally understood. They hadn't sealed him away. They had fed him. Every name spoken, every tear shed, every act of remembrance, it hadn't banished the preacher. It had given him form, substance, a place in the world's memory. and memory once rooted cannot be unmade. The last thing Elias saw before the trees closed in around him was the stone disc sinking back into the earth, sealing not a vault but a mouth. And from the house on Sycamore Lane, a hymn began to play, softly at first, then louder, carried on a wind that blew from no direction at all. The next morning the listening ground looked unchanged. The snow was pristine. The gates stood open. The apple trees were bare. But the elderberry jam jar left on the bench that day? It was filled not with fruit, but with teeth. And in the town archives, Wren's final journal entry, previously blank on the last page, now bore fresh handwriting in a script no one recognized. Asterisk, the keepers become the kept. The listeners become the silence. And the house is hungry again. Asterisk, no one speaks of it. Not yet. But children have stopped playing near the fence. The remembrance walk was canceled without explanation. And every night, just after 3:17 a.m., the lights in the old house flicker on, room by room, waiting for someone to come home. Thank you for listening to this final chapter from Shadow Storyteller. If you feel a chill that won't fade, remember, some stories don't end. They only wait. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below, if you still can. Sweet dreams.